Good evening. My name is Christine Binger. This is the case study of when ethics and policies collide for Module 14. To summarize what took place in the case study and who was involved, the first person we met was Richard Inman. Mr. Inman is an assistant principal at Rocket Junior High. He has taken a liking to James, who comes from the same neighborhood that Mr. Inman grew up in. He wants to help James kind of turn around his decision making and help him improve some of his choices. James is a 15-year-old student from Rocket Junior High. He is considered a bully and a leader of his group, which, based on the information, doesn't sound like a very positive group. And Mr. Inman has greatly impacted James's attendance, grades, and behavior at Rocket Junior High. Next is David. He's a young scholar, honor student. He's in the band. He's won many awards. But Mr. Inman does not know much about David beyond that. He has not taken up a relationship or kinship with him like he did James. The next person involved is a school police officer who ensures the safety of all students and is required to ensure that everybody's following laws and policies set in place. And last is the director of secondary education. He is the boss, she is the boss of Mr. Inman, and asks Mr. Inman to follow policies that are in place for the school. To summarize what occurred, Mr. Inman wanted to meet with James to discuss his progress in school. When James was on his way to the office to meet with Mr. Inman, he ran into David. There was a conversation between David and James in which something was exchanged, which was seen by a teacher and passed on to Mr. Inman, who brought both boys in to see what was exchanged. It came to the conclusion that James had brought some brass knuckles to school, which he eventually admitted in the conversation, and he asked David to hold on to them until he could use them later to take care of some business. To continue on, what happened after that was the police officer escorted both boys out because they have been committed a felony, and Mr. Inman feels extremely guilty over this because James is a known behavior issue in school, whereas David is not, and he feels extreme guilt for bringing David into something when clearly David was uncomfortable about the entire situation based on his reaction. And Mr. Inman decided he was not going to file paperwork for expulsion for David, but he did for James, and was asked by his boss to complete the paperwork for both boys, and was told he would be reprimanded if he did not. So the legal and ethical issues, to start with the legal ones, there are three core ones. The safety of all students. Bringing the brass knuckles to school indicates that the student is about to engage in an altercation that is pretty serious and disrupts the safety of one or more students, even though we do not know who that individual is that he was going to use them on. The police officer's duties, it is his job to ensure the safety, and by picking and choosing which cases he's not going to follow up on and ensure the safety would be a legal issue. And then the school district's policy, they have policies set in place that are designed to protect everybody, and so that would be a legal issue that Mr. Inman is essentially avoiding. The ethical issues is bullying. Number one, James bringing the brass knuckles and then bullying David to hold them, and David's reaction clearly indicates that this is an ongoing issue. How to handle a situation like that, as well as the equal reprimands for each student. While James has had a history of these kinds of behaviors and David did not, should they receive the same punishment when David has not exhibited any of the behaviors similar to James's? To synthesize, this is a case study that questions the legal and ethical decisions of an assistant principal when the school's policies and individual personal ethics do not align. When you're told to do something as an administrator or any kind of person and it goes directly against what you feel is right for the situation, how does one handle that, especially one in a leadership role like an assistant principal like Mr. Inman is in? The facts are that the people that are involved are all told within the story. Mr. Inman, James, David, the school police officer, the director of secondary education, James's mother, and David's mother. Even though the last two play a very small part, they are involved in what happens with their kids, and it's important to note them as key players in this incident. The place is Rocket Junior High, which is about 900 students. It seems that they have a pocket called the South Side, which sounds like is a struggling neighborhood. Students come from that neighborhood and come to school and tend to have a difficult time. It is not clearly indicated if this is the major demographic of the school, but it is highlighted as a point of interest for the school. The programs that are in place, the district's disciplinary alternative education program, where students who get expelled go to finish schooling, essentially. The district and state policy on weapons in schools, there are programs designed around that, which is why the police officer did what he did, and why the director of secondary education wants Mr. Inman to do what he should be doing. And then the district and state policy on consequences for weapons in schools. While there are clear consequences and programs for this, this is an interesting case where the consequence may not align with one of the individuals involved. And then what we do not know is there a behavior program protocol? Because of David's response when Mr. James and he were asked about the brass knuckles, clearly he is going through something, whether that be direct bullying from James or bullying in general. There needs to be some sort of behavior intervention that's taking place to see why he was reacted this way. And I think that's incredibly important to consider moving forward. And then the parents' rights, specifically for David's mother, it's clear in James's mother's response that she is familiar with these things happening with James, but David's mother is very upset, and David has proven that he's a good student, and the mom was very upset about what took place. Section 5 is to review and prioritize the information. Could the conflict, the situation, or the decision be damaging to stakeholders or the community? The situation could be damaging because clearly a student brought a weapon to school and stated that he intended to use it. This needs to be addressed in that, are weapons getting in regularly? How are they getting in? Is it the same group of people, maybe the same area? Are they wanting to be used on the same people? Who is it being used on? So this does affect people in the community, specifically the students, because it is students that are doing these things. What individuals and groups have an important stake in the outcome? James, because he got expelled for bringing the brass knuckles to campus, he has an important stake in the outcome as decisions were made for him based on his actions. David's a little different. While he was sent to the alternative program, just like James, he doesn't have a history of having discipline problems, behavior issues, attendance, or grades. So it's a question, with David, it's a question of, because it's his first offense and he didn't technically bring them on campus, how fair is his consequence? Mr. Inman, because he chose not to complete the paperwork for David but did for James, he was told that he would be issued a reprimand, an official reprimand, if he does not complete the paperwork. And then the district, in ensuring the safety and fairness for all students, if they let this slide, what other things are they going to let slide? But additionally, do they need to readdress and maybe restructure their consequence program? Have all the relevant stakeholders been consulted? I would say no in this situation. Mr. Inman is an assistant principal. He's not a head principal. So my question is, where's the head principal during this? And did Mr. Inman tell him that he was not going to file paperwork, and what role does he play? As well as David and David's mother. Like, David is clearly going through something with bullying based on his reaction. I think it's important to note that, in that if this is an ongoing problem, then clearly people at the school are not being notified and are not seeing the issues. Can I learn more about this situation? Some things I like to consider is this weapon that was brought to school an ongoing problem for many students? Or is this the first one that came on? Is it coming from the same group of students? Is it coming from the same issues, the same conflict between students? What's the normal behavior protocol for a student who has never been in trouble before? Do they normally get certain steps, like a behavior MTSS program they can join? Or is it strictly expulsion when they aren't directly connected to the crime or the incident? Where did the brass knuckles come from? Where did James get them? How are kids getting these things? That's what I would like to know. And then, like I said, where is the head principal during this, and what is his or her opinion on the situation? And do I have enough to make a decision? No, I don't have enough information to make the decision, as I would like some of those questions answered, which can only happen through communication. But clearly, based on what happened in the case study, there was not much time after the information about the brass knuckles existing before the students were taken away. Opinions and possible options and possible consequences. Option 1, Mr. Inman stands by his choice. He does not complete the expulsion papers and he receives his official reprimand. Option 2, Mr. Inman does choose to complete the paperwork, avoiding the reprimand, but how does that question his beliefs and his values and what he feels like is right? And then option 3, Mr. Inman does not complete the expulsion forms, but does advocate for the ethical decisions and cultivate professional norms by working with David David's mother, the director of secondary education, and a behavior specialist to discuss the situation, better understand David's involvement, and work towards finding more suitable sentence. Looking at the options, there are pros and cons to all of them. The pros for option 1 is that Mr. Inman essentially gets what he wants and David is happy, but the cons are that now there's a punishment for Mr. Inman and it puts the school district in question of what they should do. Option 2, David and James, the pro is that they have equal consequences, which is what the district would want, and Mr. Inman does not get the official reprimand, but the cons would be that David is severely reprimanded when he has no history of issue, and Mr. Inman goes against his professional ethics. Option 3, the pros would be a better assessment of the issue as there are many questions that are unanswered. It would provide an opportunity for all parties, including David's mother, David, and the school, come together to find a solution. Mr. Inman may not get reprimanded, though who knows, because that's a whole other case within itself if he's refusing to follow protocol. And then David may get to stay in school. However, the cons are that the whole school would need to reevaluate their policies and republish them. And it takes time and money to bring people together. How much is this going to cost in as far as time and monetary value? And Mr. Inman may still receive his official reprimand. I feel the best option is option 3. Mr. Inman does not complete the expulsion forms, but does advocate with the whole group to find a better solution. How can your decision be implemented with the greatest care and attention to the concerns of all stakeholders? I feel like with this option, you're considering everybody involved, especially considering David is a student that's never been in trouble. I feel like we need to reevaluate what happens in addition to looking at how his response was triggering when he was asked to comment on the situation that took place in front of James. And I think at minimum, there needs to be a reevaluation of how things are getting into the building and how students are treating others, as well as possibly David's consequence as a result of this, because clearly he was not protected by the school. Implementing your decision, I would take a couple steps, and a lot of these steps are contingent on how people respond. So step 1 is to require a meeting with the director of secondary education to get support in holding a meeting. Step 2 is to meet with David and his mother to discuss more calmly what they feel about the situation, maybe get more information, and hopefully get them to be willing to come to the table and have a discussion. Step 3 would be, once they would have to accept that, otherwise you can't move forward. Step 3 would be to hold a meeting with everyone to discuss the policies, David's history, issue of bullying, and potential alternative consequences for David. And then step 4 is come to an agreement and create an action plan. Some things that come from this, possible issues, that either the district or David and his mother are unwilling to participate in a meeting, which would mean that Mr. Inman would have to go back and either write the paperwork for David or not and get the reprimand. And either one would not be probably wholly ethical for Mr. Inman, but he would have to make a choice if no one's willing to come together. Another possible issue is that there are no alternative suggestions, but hopefully at minimum they can get the board or the district to look at the bullying policies and the safety policies to prevent future things like this happening. And Mr. Inman receives his official reprimand and further action may be taken. Who needs to know? I feel like if everybody decides to come together and come to a solution, then the procedures and policies are going to have to change in the handbook and in the district policy book, which would change how situations are handled further. It would make it a case-by-case basis. Did this student have any reprimands before? How many? What were the issues? And so on before you can give an actual consequence. While this would be a very time-consuming process, and who knows what would happen with David in the meantime. For example, would they still prevent him from coming to school until they come to a conclusion? I do think that it's the best one because in a situation like this, two students that are very different, have very different parts of the story, very different types of involvement, should require very different consequences. But I think the bigger issue is the brass knuckles got into the school. A student felt bullied to the point where they were crippled and unable to answer questions. And those two things would need to be the win coming out of this for Mr. Inman if they are unwilling, the district is unwilling to create a different consequence for David. I think that's something that's very important to look at moving forward as an educator, in that not every case is cut and dry, like giving students a fair consequence, but also look at what got us to this point and see what we can do to prevent it from happening in the future. I think that's the moral of this case study, and I feel like that's something that we should take forward as we become leaders. Thank you for listening and have a great night.